Hello and welcome to the Field Guides. I'm Bill and I'm here with Steve. Good afternoon, Steve.
Good afternoon, Bill.
And I'm here with Daniel. Good afternoon, Daniel.
Good afternoon, Bill. How are we doing today?
All right. And what we're going to do today, and over the course of many future episodes,
is get out of the wind.
And that's what we're doing right now.
and it's not a lie. We often have to do this.
Yes. So we are hunkered down next to a building here. And what we're going to do today is give you the idea of what it's like to be in the woods, in the field, and on the trail. Each month, we pick a natural history topic, research the science behind that topic, and then take you out to a natural spot and share everything that we've learned. And we are out here on it's a second day of spring here in Western New York, but it's like, it's a very wintry day. So Steve and Daniel and I, we just spent the last 10 minutes trying to find a spot that's out of the wind.
Yep.
But we've now hunkered down behind or next to an old building. We are here at Reinstein Woods. What's the full title, Daniel?
Nature Preserve.
Okay, Reinstein Woods Nature Preserve.
That was not complicated. I thought it was going to be a lot more than that.
I don't want to leave anything out.
He's giving me easy tasks to start
Yeah.
You'll do the heavy lifting later. So this is the site of two of our previous episodes, our witch hazel episode and then our deer exclosure episode, which was one of our Steve-less episodes.
Yes, I was going to say, I was only here for one of those. Yeah.
That's right.
And we weren't here alone either.
What do you mean?
Were we with Jerry Rising?
Oh, that's right. Jerry Rising, who sadly passed away.
Bill will not come here with me alone. I don't know what's with him, but
he knows better.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it off mic.
Right.
All right, so folks, we are here on, what is today, guys? March 21st?
Yeah.
20th or 21st?
I think it's the 20th. March 20th, yes, because yesterday was the first day of spring.
19th, yeah.
So we are here March 20th, 2023, and we are less than 2 weeks away from a very big celestial event.
Oh, yeah.
It's 2024.
Did I say 23?
You did.
See, I said that. See if you would catch it.
Okay.
Well done. So
The Eclipse.
the eclipse.
Yeah.
So Steve, do you know what the topic is?
Well, sort of. Daniel spoiled it.
Oh, okay.
Slightly, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to keep
but
it.
to be completely honest, I have no idea what the content could be based on what I was told.
So this is the first episode where we're doing
A pseudoscience topic.
Yes. No, I was going to say a non-biological topic.
No. Ice spikes.
Oh, that's true. I
Yeah.
forgot about the ice spikes one. Okay, the second one. So
He's getting old.
I
Yeah,
do.
I know,
50. I know,
Jesus.
come on, Steve.
I do want to be honest, and I hope
He's
this
not always thinking about ice spikes 24/7.
No. I do have to say, I hope it's okay, Daniel, that Daniel was a little apprehensive about taking this on because he felt that people might be, I don't know if tired is the right word.
Well, I want to clarify that stance because at first when you brought it up, you just mentioned the eclipse in general. And I was like, there's so much content out there about the eclipse. It's kind of already a saturated topic. But when you mention, that it'd be a little bit more specific, a more specific aspect about it, then my hesitations dropped.
Then you're
For
on
sure.
board.
So
All
don't
right.
worry, Bill.
All right.
Don't worry. I trust you.
So by the end of the episode, everyone's going to learn that it's when the moon goes in front of the sun.
Done.
Perfect. Yeah.
Now, I did want to put this at the top of the episode because right now, just like you said, like the topic of the eclipse is everywhere, especially here, folks, in Western New York where we're recording, because we are dead center in the path of totality.
Yeah.
In other parts of the country, maybe it's not so saturated, but I feel like 6 months, a year, 2-3 years from now, when someone might be listening to this, the eclipse may not be on the forefront of their mind like it is on a lot of people's mind right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are specifically like traveling to Buffalo and other cities in totality just to make the trip. I know I did in 2017. There was one in Southern Illinois.
Yeah.
And like pretty much everyone I knew who was there, we were all making the trip down separately, but everyone was doing it. You have to.
Umbraphiles.
Umbraphiles, is that really what it is?
That's
yeah.
what it is. Those are eclipse chasers.
Got it.
Umbra refers to the moon's shadow.
Well, we're going to meet a lot of them in April, that's for sure.
Yes. And that is one thing that I did not realize until I started doing research, that people are expecting that traffic is going to be insane.
Oh, it's going to be a party. I'm pretty sure. I assume like the fairgrounds are going to be like just loaded. And, yeah.
So, as I mentioned, Buffalo is dead center in the path of totality where we're going to see the full total eclipse where the moon is blocking the sun. So, I wanted this episode not to be about the basics of eclipses because I feel like, as you alluded to, Daniel, that information's out there everywhere. So, I wanted this episode to be about things that maybe most eclipse information givers aren't providing. So how do eclipses affect the atmosphere? How do they affect plants? How do they affect wildlife? once I started getting into it, I realized pretty quickly that I was going to have to pare that down. So today we're really going to talk briefly about some things that will happen atmospherically, like to the weather, things that I didn't know about. And then we'll really delve into how eclipses affect animals and chiefly birds, because they seem to be the most studied when it comes to eclipses.
So I'm going to say right now, I'm excited for whatever comes out of this episode, because in my mind, because isn't like totality only like 4 minutes or something?
So here it's going to last about 3 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay.
Yep.
So in my mind, I'm glad that other people have thought about this, but it almost seems like, how is this going to affect anything in 3.5 minutes? But,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what you're going to find, though, is before totality, there is, the process of the moon slowly going over.
Right.
So you get that, partial coverage, and then you get totality, and then you get some partial coverage after. So.
Oh, yeah. The partial coverage, when you're experiencing it, it's like you would never know there was partial coverage.
Right.
Unless you have like the special glasses on and you're specifically, or you're like looking through a camera, at it.
Right.
But
So it's hard to
it feels,
distinguish at which like phase it is.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
when it's actually total versus.
So
It's
if it's not
nearly
totality,
impossible. Yeah.
were you here for the 2017 eclipse?
Well, I was here in Western New York, but it wasn't in totality here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So do you remember though? Like we didn't see much change in light
No,
levels or things
no,
like that.
no.
Yeah.
But I will say, it's really cool to experience it, because
Oh,
I was, when I was in a path of totality in 2017, it was, everything suddenly felt like cooler. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was
Makes
so
sense.
weird. You're in the middle of the day and suddenly it just goes dark, right? And like, I don't know. It's something I'm really looking forward to.
So
seeing
you did travel to see it?
I traveled to. Yeah, I was saying I went to Southern Illinois.
Oh, I
yeah.
didn't know. Because when you talked about it a few minutes ago, I thought
Yeah.
you just said people you knew went.
No, and then I just went too. Yeah,
And we
yeah.
didn't even talk about
It
it.
was good.
Oh.
I was at Reinstein Woods for it.
It was really good.
You were probably mad at me then.
No, I have a few pictures of it on my phone. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Thanks for sharing. All right. So in my research, there are a few things I did want to share. I did not know this is the only place in our solar system where total eclipses can happen,
Oh.
where a moon can perfectly mask the sun, and it's
Right.
completely coincidence, because the sun just happens to be 400 times larger than our moon, but the sun it also just happens to be 400 times farther away from us than the moon is.
Wow.
That's
Does that
cool.
make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the ratio's there.
So the two appear to be the same size in the sky. So
Wow.
if
Some would argue that they are the same size, and they're only six.
Wait, they're
600
not?
or 6 miles. Wait, what is it? No, 6,000 miles away. I don't know what the number is.
Is that what
but
it is?
I think so.
is that
Something
what
like that.
flat earthers believe?
No. Maybe I'm confusing the 6 million years or whatever versus
Oh, the young
or
Earth
6,000
creationists.
years
Yes.
versus
Young
something
Earth
like that.
creationists.
But either way, it's real close.
I heard someone refer to that idea as short Earth creationists.
Short.
I like that better because it just sounds fun.
Yeah.
All right. If the moon was any farther away, it would just appear as a black dot crossing the face of the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And then any closer, the moon would completely black out the sun, leaving no sign of the corona. So do you know about the corona?
Is the corona the circle, like the slight light circle around the moon?
Right. So when the moon, when totality happens, when the moon is blocking out the sun,
Mm-hmm.
we will see a halo around the sun, and that's the sun's atmosphere. And if conditions are right, if you have binoculars, you'll actually be able to see prominences, those
the arcs?
ejections of material, those arcs
yeah.
coming off of the sun.
That's
And
cool.
I didn't realize this until I started doing research. When totality is in place, you can look at it because the sun is blocked out.
Yeah.
And the light that's coming off is light that's going perpendicular. It's not coming
Okay.
at you. But you got to be careful.
Yeah, because like the second it
Yeah.
moves away.
The second it moves away.
I don't.
yeah.
If the president of the United States looked directly at it,
Former
I
president.
think I could do it.
I think I'm going to make that the picture for this episode. Trump looking up. All right. So first, let's talk about how it's going to affect the weather and the atmosphere around us. So you already mentioned one thing, the temperature shift.
Yeah, it felt like a kind of a sudden drop.
So when that totality hits, it is going to be a drop. Typical drop is from 5 to 15 degrees in the path of totality.
Wow.
And they'll usually, that low usually will not hit until 5 to 20 minutes after totality. It just takes a little while for kind of temperatures to catch up. One extreme case, in 2001, there was an eclipse in Africa, and temperatures dropped from the low 80s down to the upper 60s.
Whoa.
Now, the amount depends on a number of factors. So that can include location, the surrounding landscape and the climate, what season it is, the time of day, and the big one is cloud cover. So obviously, if cloud cover is heavy, temperature drops are going to be noticeably less.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a 2017 study in Nebraska that compared the eclipse conditions at 2 different sites. One was a forest along a stream, and then another was a wet meadow prairie. And they found a 5-degree difference in those temperature drops. And they're figuring it's just likely a result of the differences in the habitat features.
I'm imagining the forest changed less.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that was probably insulated from the full effects, whereas that prairie was just fully exposed.
Right, right.
So the other thing that can happen is called an eclipse wind. So when the moon blocks out the sun, there's typically a change in wind speed and direction. So this can even occur during a partial eclipse, because as the sun disappears, the ground suddenly cools and the warm air stops rising from the ground. That causes a drop in wind speed and a shift in direction.
That makes sense.
In the United Kingdom in 2015, they did a study where they had about 4,500 people collecting data, weather data, during an eclipse, along with a number of weather stations in their observations. And this was just a partial eclipse. And they noted that winds fell by just over about 2 miles an hour on average and changed direction by about 20 degrees. The weird part is the effect only lasts for a few minutes during the eclipse. And then as soon as the eclipse is done, the winds return to normal.
That
Now,
also makes sense, I feel.
I was trying to find the wind changes that would occur during a total eclipse,
Yeah.
but I couldn't find anyone who's done that research. So
Right.
if a listener is aware of it and they can forward that to us, please do.
If the air is changing temperature, I'm trying not to get my physics wrong, but because I know like pressure, they would say like the flow goes from high to low. So if you're like a high pressure, it'll flow into a low pressure area. So I wonder, you said the wind slowed down?
Yep.
I don't know.
It falls.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's cooling down.
Mm-hmm.
So you have cooler, and it's not, because usually you're moving from warmer to cooler.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, really, that's what wind is. It's just air moving from temperature differences, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe this will help clear it up. Because one thing that could possibly happen, I could not find any accounts of this actually happening, but it came up in several different articles where eclipse-induced thunderstorms. So in areas where it isn't cloudy, an eclipse breeze could form, and if the air temperature drops far enough in the path of totality, it could create a strip of cool air that will sink and spread out. And then as the cooler air spreads out, it could dip under the warmer air outside the totality zone. And that could theoretically create lift for clouds and perhaps thunderstorms.
Interesting.
So theoretically, this hasn't been observed? Or-
I could not find any records of it actually happening,
Okay.
but
like, all right,
it's
all right,
mentioned.
guys,
It'll happen this April, man.
It's mentioned-
All right, guys, we
quite a
got
bit.
3.5 minutes to study this. Yeah.
And
I'm
that's
get
the
ready.
And you know what? That actually goes into the next thing I was going to talk about, because now I want to start talking about animal responses.
You know, can I just say one thing? You
Yeah.
would think NOAA would have, because some type of like
Oh,
time lapse or
you
something.
mean NOAA?
Yeah, what did I say?
I thought you meant Noah, like from the
biblical?
Bible.
Yeah.
Bill's always thinking about the Bible.
I am.
Yeah.
You would think Noah would have something like
Right,
that.
right.
though.
Like,
Yeah.
because I think if there was something to see, seeing it on like a far off, like a distant scale would be kind of cool, if there is anything.
Good opportunities for community science, for sure.
Mhm.
And there are. I'm going to talk about those at the end of the episode.
Cool.
So for our listeners outside the U.S., what is NOAA?
I don't know.
National
I can't remember what it stands for.
National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Good memory.
I was just going to say that.
So think about this. Light cues, they elicit strong responses from nearly all forms of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most notably, circadian rhythms, that day and that night.
Say most importantly, plants.
Right. But we're not going to talk about those.
Actually, let's just stick on plants for a little while.
The regularity of those rhythms, that day and night shift, is such a critical component of so many biological cycles. You got to imagine that an eclipse is going to throw that off. So one of the earliest stories comes from an Italian monk in the year 1239 of animals responding to an eclipse. Now, his name was Ristoro di Arezzo. I was going to try to read this in an Italian accent, but I practiced it and it was no good.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that was
Yeah.
with practice too? Yeesh.
No, the quote, not his name.
Oh, okay.
I was just saying his name. So he said, as the sky turned dark, he wrote, all the animals and birds were terrified, and the wild beasts could easily be caught. So there's lots of historical references like this. And in the centuries since, there's studies and anecdotal accounts, and they report a wide variety of behaviors. One from a total eclipse in Hawaii in 1991 It described birds along a pier displaying excited activity before and after totality. The quote says, "We could hardly hear each other talk. The birds were vocalizing so much. Then came totality, not a sound. It was deathly quiet. The difference between the noise levels before and during totality was stunning."
It kind of makes sense because you think like when you hear birds the most, it's always earlier in the morning and then in the evening.
Later in the evening, right?
It's almost like it simulates those conditions.
See, you're very astute because that's going to come up.
First time for everything.
Well, I do wonder though, because in my mind, the first thing I think of is silent panic. Right?
That might be it too.
It just goes dark, and you're like,
3 minutes.
don't move.
All right, one of the most comprehensive accounts of animal behavior during an eclipse, at least until recent decades, was a paper from 1923 by this guy, William Wheeler, and his collaborators. And listeners out there, we just got to tell you, today it's going to be windy. We're trying our best to kind of stop talking and then start talking again when it's not windy anymore, but this is going to be a choppy one, so
Yeah.
we're doing the best we can. One of the most comprehensive accounts of animal behavior during an eclipse was a paper from the early 1900s by this
What
guy. I'm not sure. By this guy, William Wheeler. And this was in the proceedings in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This was a big deal. For this project, they invited game wardens, naturalists, and the public to study how the eclipse affected animal behavior. And they compiled nearly 500 observations. It's an interesting paper to read through because they group the observations by taxa, by different groups of animals.
Yeah.
And they kind of list specific observations, but then they also kind of make general comments. And it's written in that great, like, early naturalist observational style.
Yeah.
Like at one point, Wheeler is writing about how animals are reacting to the eclipse, and he says, "At no time did the animals react with as much ignorance as men and women in the Middle Ages." I'm like, man.
What?
I'm like, where'd that come from?
Greatest simile of all time.
Yeah. How much of this was people just saying what their dog was doing?
Some of it was.
Or what the
Okay.
chickens are doing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
saw a lot too.
But a lot of it was not just wild animals. It was domestic animals as
Yeah.
well, farm animals. So they were interested in everything. Insects, that was a big one. So if you look at Wheeler's paper and kind of a lot of the papers since, because a lot of the research that I looked at alluded to Wheeler's paper or other papers that kind of compiled observations. And kind of a general list is that when you get a total eclipse, often what will happen is birds will cease to call, birds will return to nocturnal roosts. You mentioned kind of evening activity. Nocturnal insects might take flight. Other nocturnal or crepuscular animals will increase their activity. What does crepuscular mean, Steve?
Whether the sun's going down or coming up, right?
That's right, yeah. Diurnal fish might seek shelter and nocturnal fish will emerge. Spiders might destroy and deconstruct their webs. Or captive animals will alter their activity. But if you look at lots of papers like I did, you'll find that a lot of the reports are often contradictory. Like this type of animal will react this way in this one spot for this eclipse.
But sorry, I like the idea of people from the 1920s describing things contradictorily. It's like, well, yeah, because this guy said, oh, and then my bull adopted a constitution unlike, whatever. And then
Exactly.
Another,
Yep.
another, yeah.
And that's exactly how they talk. It's totally true. So I'm going to share, there's 5 or 6 papers I'm going to share. And the first one is more of a general study, and that's looking at the 2017 eclipse that you're talking about.
Okay.
And it's called the Aeroecology of a Solar Eclipse. So
I remember there was a number of like physics articles that came out that they actually ran some experiments specifically on during totality, right?
This is not that.
Oh, I remember it had something to do with like Einstein or something. I don't know.
Oh, well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
Because that's
Well,
one thing.
I said pretty much all I can say on the matter.
Well, Einstein,
Good job, Steve.
they used an eclipse to prove Einstein's theory of relativity.
Right, like warping of space-time or something.
Right, because he said that massive objects in space should warp space-time.
Oh, it's because they wanted to see things behind the sun, but they couldn't do it until the moon was blocking most of
Exactly.
the sun. Yeah, I remember.
So in
Yeah.
the early 20s, another physicist, when there was an eclipse, they took measurements of these 2 stars near the sun, and then when the moon was blocking the sun, they took those measurements again, and the stars moved. So it was proving that the sun was moving, or at least changing the light coming from those stars.
Right.
So eclipses did help prove Einstein's theory of relativity. But this has nothing to do with it.
Okay. But you had mentioned something that made me think that physics was going to come into this. I don't know why.
But you did mention earlier about experimental manipulation and light cues. So manipulating light cues on a large scale is almost impossible, except on rare predictable occasions, like an eclipse, right? So in most cases, an eclipse is going to be novel to animals, and consequently, it's going to induce behaviors we're not used to seeing at that time. Now, what's been documented so far is often based on anecdotal observation rather than standardized ones. And I'm going to be saying that several times because a lot of the papers that have come out within recent years, they make mention of that. Even if they're still basing their observations on anecdotal ones. But this one tried to use a more standardized approach. So this study used weather surveillance radar to investigate responses of flying animals during the total solar eclipse.
Oh, that's a good way to do it.
So for people that aren't aware, these weather radars, they register not only meteorological, I knew I was going to have a hard time saying it, but also biological targets.
Yeah.
So birds, bats, and insects.
A friend of the podcast, Tom Kerr, is always posting.
Birdcast.
Yeah. Oh, Birdcast, which is, it's not a special radar for birds, right?
Right.
It's just a weather radar, but they're excited because the birds are what is picked up during like migration.
We'll link this in the episode notes, but if you're interested in birds and migration, check out Birdcast, because during migration times, it is amazing to see these radar pictures of birds emerging at dusk, taking flight.
Yeah.
And
if you're not into it, get good, as the kids say.
Get good?
Yeah.
Man, I'm behind.
Do better.
Kid lingo.
Yeah.
I've never heard that.
So these networks...
I think it's just do better, pretty much.
Haven't heard that either.
We done? All right.
Get good, Bill.
These networks, they have a continental scale. They cover the continent, and they operate continuously, so they're perfect for investigating rare, large-scale events like these that involve these biological targets. So they used 138 radar stations across the U.S. looking at whether changes in the light levels during the eclipse led to an increase of the animals in the air, similar to what occurs at sunset during migration, or if it mainly suppressed diurnal activity. So they gathered data during the eclipse, at sunset on that day for comparison, but then also the 2 days before and after as controls. Now, I do want to mention, of the 138 stations, the sun reached 95 to 100% obscuration at 26 sites. So obscuration means how much it was covered. A lot of historical accounts say that anything less than 95% coverage of the sun isn't going to cause a reaction in animals. But I found that's not always true. So we're going to talk about that more towards the end of the podcast. So the results. Flight activity during the eclipse was notably different than activity at sunset. The darkness of a solar eclipse appeared insufficient to trigger flight with the same magnitude as was typically observed at sunset during migration. Leading up to and after the maximum eclipse, biological activity decreased, indicating that daytime active birds and insects were landing. So this is consistent with some observations from other eclipse studies using radar. It's also consistent with anecdotal observations of wildlife exhibiting behaviors like roosting and ceasing vocalizations during the eclipse. They did say there was a short, low altitude, widespread spike of biological activity during totality in some of the radars. But it was interesting how they broke it down. They said this wouldn't be birds, because birds, when they're migrating, they usually wait until a while after sunset to take off. And they said it wasn't really localized in specific areas, which would be bats emerging from wherever they're roosting. So they were figuring it was possibly nocturnal insects taking flight during totality. So overall, they said results suggest that light changes from the eclipse were insufficient to trigger nocturnal activity like that occurring after sunset. But it was sufficient to suppress that diurnal activity, that daytime activity.
Well, that makes sense if birds normally wait till well after sunset before they start migrating, then total darkness that only lasts a few minutes wouldn't trigger them to do it.
So
makes total sense.
They kind of decrease the activity thinking, oh, night is falling, but then they're like, oh wait, sun's coming back out.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I do...
And the bats are not going to see it anyway, right?
What do you mean?
It's not like they're out and about.
That is true. Now...
Oh, that's sad. They miss it every time, man.
The decrease in biological activity, they made a special point here. The decrease in biological activity started at low levels of obscuration where humans wouldn't perceive much change in light levels. So remember you mentioned how when it was a partial eclipse, you really couldn't tell that light levels were changing. So why would they start shifting behavior with a minor change in light? Now I'm going to ask you to put a pin in that.
Yeah.
And you listeners out there, put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that. So the next paper I'm going to look at, this is from the eclipse that you mentioned, the one in 2017. But before I do that, I'm just going to shift.
Yeah.
Because Daniel and I are going to try to create a wall for the mic.
I think it's better this way.
All right, because the folks, the wind is pretty bad.
Yeah.
All right. So this paper started off talking again about how a lot of the data collected during eclipse on animal behaviors is observational. So they wanted to make it more standard. And they did mention that the observations that are made are often contradictory. They talked about how black-crowned night herons, which have been documented in one report to respond noisily to an eclipse, in another have exhibited no response. So they broke down kind of a general view of what's been observed about animals during eclipses, as these behaviors can be classified in one of four ways. Animals might commence evening routines or exhibit nighttime behaviors. They might exhibit responses related with fear or anxiety. They might exhibit a novel behavior or response, or they might have no response at all. So I like kind of how they kind of put those into those four groups. You can kind of slide a behavior into one of those. During this study, they looked at 17 species, and that included mammals, birds, and reptiles, so at the zoo. Everything from primates to sea lions, from flamingos to cockatoos, tortoises to Komodo dragons. The observations began 2 days prior to the eclipse to get baseline data, because they wanted to mirror both the seasonal and the climatic conditions of the eclipse. But also those 2 days prior were the zoo's highest attendance weekend for the summer, and they wanted to mirror the high attendance of people at the zoo during the eclipse, because they were pretty honest, figuring that the number of people that are at the zoo, that's probably going to impact the animals as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So the animals were observed for 3 hours, bracketing the time that the eclipse took place. And they had, for each enclosure, they had some volunteers, they had keepers, and then they also had biologists. Kind of as a team, they had all been trained in observation techniques, what they were looking for. For the results, 3 mammal species, grizzly bears, sea lions, harbor seals, and then 1 bird, the kookaburra, had no discernible change. Didn't seem to care at all what was happening. The majority of species displayed behaviors typical of evening routines. For like the gorillas, for example, they walked over to their entrance to their indoor enclosure in their typical hierarchical order. It's the same thing they do every night before being secured for the night. And then they resumed their typical behaviors after totality. Elephants more or less did the same thing, walked toward their overnight enclosure. But in 6 of the 17 species, there was a display of potential anxiety. Komodo dragons, for example, at totality, he ran up to its evening den entrance, which happened to be closed, and then just proceeded to run around its enclosure erratically. What the hell's going on?
That's what I do during eclipses.
Right? A pair of siamangs, which are these gibbons from Indonesia, they
What's
usually...
a gibbon? Is it like a monkey or something?
It's an ape.
Okay.
So it's a tailless ape. That's kind of redundant. But they usually call to each other in the morning, but these animals during the eclipse, they sang to each other in unusual tunes, like the keepers were unfamiliar with the tunes that they were singing. The flamingos huddled around each other. The baboons, which usually self-separate into 2 subgroups, at totality, both the groups got together and started to run around the enclosure as a group. And then when totality was over, they again self-separated into their 2 normal groups.
Interesting.
The paper did say, though, that right before the baboons started to get together, a helicopter had flown overhead and there was a large group nearby that had been very vocal. So they thought maybe they were already feeling anxious.
Okay.
But I liked how they were trying to factor in all the different things that were happening.
But I like the idea of the bear who didn't didn't change at all. It's just internally freaking out. Like, so what do we know bears do? They're like, I don't know what bears do, but like same thing, no change. But
they're stoic. They hide their pain.
It's the end of the world. It's the end of the world. It's the end of the world.
He's freaking out inside, right?
Yeah. Stay strong. Stay strong.
Can't let everybody see.
So there was an account of this study in like an article for the general population, and they talked to the lead researcher, and the researcher did say that, my favorite quote was, she was talking about the Galapagos tortoises, and she says they generally do absolutely nothing all day, but they exhibit a novel behavior because during the peak of the eclipse, they all started breeding.
Whoa.
Oh.
They're figuring it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
So she said the cause of that behavior is still unclear. So overall, 76% of the species exhibited some behavioral response, so 3 out of 4, to the eclipse. The predominant response was mimicking evening or nighttime behavior. So the 5 taxa that showed behaviors associated with anxiety, they did say anthropogenic human factors may have contributed to this response, because they did say, like, during the eclipse, all the people there were freaking out too.
Was that data included in there? Like what people do during eclipse? What crazy stuff people do during
No.
eclipses?
There's a study for you. So in April of this year, so the eclipse that's coming up, the same team, they have a similar study planned at a zoo in Texas with some of the similar species, because they want to be able to compare results.
Yeah.
I heard the Buffalo Zoo's planning on doing some kind of study as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, see,
Why not?
if I was good, I would have looked into that. All right, so that is the halfway point, and this is a good time to do our gum leaf ad break.
Oh, yeah.
Longtime listeners know that Gum Leaf Boots has been a sponsor of the podcast for a long time. Steve and I are proud owners of Gum Leaf Boots that they provided to us. And Daniel here, who has yet to receive a pair of Gum Leaf Boots,
He's heard some
You said
good
it,
things
not
about
me.
it, though. Yeah.
is going to speak about Gum Leaf Boots. Take it away, Daniel.
Gumleaf USA boots are made from 85% natural rubber, which is why they can flex over 1 million times without a crack. Wow. Competitive brands use between 25% and 50% rubber mixed with plastics and synthetics. So you'll buy several pairs of their models to equal 1 pair of Gumleaf USA boots. Comfort, durability, and quality are the hallmark of Gumleaf USA boots.
And
Man, they sound awesome.
They are.
Must be nice.
Sounds like a guy that knows what he's talking about.
And
Personally.
Steve, what do patrons get?
Oh my God, this wind. Patrons get free shipping, but you have to go to our Patreon page and become a member if you're not one already, and then you can get the code there. Only for members.
That's right. All right, back to the episode. So for the next study, which is really not a study, this is from the Cornell Lab of Observation. Oh my God. Cornell Lab of Ornithology. This wind is getting to me. This also looked at the 2017 study, and what they did is they wanted to see if they could corroborate anecdotal observations from eBird lists. So anyone out there that doesn't know, eBird is an app that birders use to record their observations, but you can also make comments with radar data. So what they found is that radar in their study did reveal an emptying sky. So just like that study I mentioned previously. The radar loop that they have on the page for this article, there was a radar loop from South Carolina showing flying animals getting lower to the ground as the eclipse progressed, flying lowest in the minutes after totality, and then taking to the air again as the eclipse ended. So they made a nice animation where they drew a circle around everything that was flying, and you could watch it slowly shrink. The circle gets smaller, and then as the eclipse ended, the circle would get wider again.
So they're landing?
They're landing. Yeah.
Not like, well, I was going to say not like shearwaters and storm petrels and stuff probably, but
I don't know. I mean, they're looking over.
They just crash into the water.
They're looking over land.
They're just panicking for 3 minutes over a dark sea.
Oh no!
That would be interesting though, like out over the ocean to see what, seabirds are doing, right?
Yeah.
So the eBird accounts though are interesting to read through. We'll post this article because you can read through the individual eBird accounts. They talked about nocturnal and crepuscular birds emerging. Observations of common nighthawks were widespread during totality.
Wow.
So that was bringing out nocturnal birds. Owls, including barred owls, great horns, screech owls. There was one account of a screech owl singing emphatically and making odd contact calls for about 2 minutes, starting 20 seconds after the end of totality.
Well, it's still pretty dark. 20 seconds after the end of totality, it'd still be
It gets bright
dark.
pretty quick though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, as soon as totality's over, yeah.
Okay,
it's almost
just
like
kidding.
someone switches a light on. But I didn't know this either. I went to a program at the local planetarium at Buff State, and it was amazing. Like he went to see the one that you did in 2017 down in Kentucky, and he said when totality hit, it was like a switch. All of the cicadas stopped singing and all of the crickets started singing.
Whoa.
And he said when totality ended, it was like it just switched immediately back.
Wow.
He also did say when he drove down, he picked up family in Cincinnati and drove to Kentucky. He said that took 4 hours. To drive back took 11 hours.
Sheesh.
So he was
that makes
just
sense.
stressing
Yeah.
how bad traffic is going to be.
You got to bring a tent with you.
He said it's basically like a sporting event or a concert. Everybody gets there at different times, but everybody leaves at the same time.
Yeah.
All right, nocturnal migrants acted as if they were departing for nighttime migration. There was one example from New Jersey, someone who actually works for Birdcast. He was talking about a Baltimore Oriole he was watching near the beach. He said, I watched this bird from the boardwalk slowly work its way to the top of a tree and then take flight, flying straight southeast over the road and toward the ocean. I ran to the beach to watch the bird, and I saw it fly out of sight over the ocean, showing what looked like overwater nocturnal migration.
And then it gets light again, and it's like, oh,
It's like,
turn
crap.
around.
God. All right, now, this was my favorite study because this is something that I would like to do here in Western New York. In 2023, a study came out. I should say it came out. It's actually in preprint right now, so this is not a peer-reviewed study. So we take this with a grain of salt.
Yeah, we got non-peer-reviewed stuff, anecdotal stuff.
I know,
We're
right?
going downhill.
This is probably our most anecdotally based episode.
I will say preprints, sometimes they never get released,
Right.
right? But like, I have to imagine most of the time they get past review, and some new version gets published. So
This doesn't seem too crazy.
we'll see. Yeah, we'll see.
Nothing jumped out at me anyway. All right, so
This was written by AI, actually.
this is called solar bird banding.
What?
Notes on changes in avian behavior while mist netting during an eclipse.
I can't even get one out of the mist net in 3.5 minutes.
Folks, if you haven't listened to our bird banding episode, if you're not familiar with bird banding, it's something that Steve and I have done. We're going to get Daniel involved, hopefully.
Yes.
But it's a way to study birds by catching them in very fine mesh nets called mist nets. And you put a silver band on their leg and it has a number on it, so if they're caught again, they can be tracked. How long they're living, where they're traveling.
Well, it's hardly called catching them again when you get one out of an owl pellet. Because that's also an exciting find.
This is true. If you find a dead bird with a band, that's still data, right? Our European listeners, you'll know it as bird ringing.
Okay.
So this study, at least according to this study, it's the first time anyone has done bird banding during an eclipse.
That's not that hard to believe.
It surprised me. I was surprised because we do one of our volunteer bird banders is a researcher, Gavin Layton, who wrote the paper that we based our Downey Harry episode on.
Yeah.
I actually emailed him and said, hey, do you want to be the second team to bird band during an eclipse? So we're talking about it. So this study was conducted out in Utah.
To be honest, when we bird band though, like I could easily see just sleeping through the eclipse if there was one
What do you
that
mean?
early in the morning.
Oh,
Because how early do you have to get there in the earliest part of the season? Like
Well,
5 a.m. or something?
if whatever your protocol is, we usually open at sunrise.
Yeah.
So you got to get there pretty early. But the eclipse is going to be happening here at 3 p.m.
Yeah.
So we'd be
it's a good
shifting our
time. Yeah.
Now, this study, this bird banding, took place in October of last year because if you remember, there was an eclipse in the fall. It went from Oregon down to Texas, but it was an annular eclipse. Now, that has nothing to do with the word annual. I learned about this from the program I went to. So an annular eclipse is when there's almost a total eclipse, but the moon, it's in the part of its orbit, it's farthest away from the Earth. So I forget what that's called, perigee.
Can't remember.
Because remember, the moon's orbit is an oval, and the Earth is not in the center of that oval.
No.
It's off center. So there's times when the moon is closer to the Earth and farther away from the Earth.
Kind
That's
of like
why-
the Earth and the Sun. There's a
Right, exactly.
But have you ever heard the if we were only a few feet closer or whatever miles closer to the Sun, we would all die,
We'd be
or if we're
dead.
further away. Yeah, it's like no. I think our orbit differs by like millions of miles.
Right.
Yeah.
So the annular, that refers to a ring, because when an annular eclipse happens, it's when the moon is farther away from the Earth. So when the moon does pass in front of it, it's blocking the sun, but there's still a ring of sun around the moon. Okay, so that's why it's called an annular solar eclipse. So that's probably why it wasn't as widespread in the media this past fall. So their goal in this study was to look at activity during bird banding, using bird banding data, again, because so often what's documented is anecdotal. In bird banding, you follow usually a pretty tight protocol. They hypothesized that bird captures would decline during peak totality, mirroring bird behavior at dusk.
I was gonna say, but if they're all coming out of the skies right into the nets, maybe.
Think about that, because that's
Okay.
going to come up. Since they banned at this site April through October, they had plenty of data for an analysis comparing data from days at that same location across multiple years. And they were looking specifically at the 2-week period around the eclipse day. So what they found, the number of birds they captured during the eclipse, 39 birds, was the highest ever. Not just on that date in October, but on any banding day across 11 years at that location.
Wow. I mean, the sun disappearing is a pretty good distraction, right, from the nets.
Sure.
Because even if they were just like panicking a little bit,
Yeah.
like, oh, you know.
So you're trying to figure out what is going on. The majority of birds banded that day were captured during the 2 hours of the eclipse between 9:30 and 11:30 a.m. And the biggest spike was during the peak of partial totality, around 10:30 a.m. They said, okay, this runs counter to behavioral responses of birds in other studies. Most see declines in overall activity. Many of those studies, though, were observational in nature, not like bird banding. So they said, now birds may have been imitating their typical end-of-day behavior with the sudden onset of darkness, and then as peak totality approached, they were trying to return to find a place to roost,
Yeah.
thinking that dusk was happening, and maybe the mist nets stopped them from doing that. And in that case, their results would be similar to the other anecdotal or just the other studies that have been done. On the other hand, they said the eclipse could have caused the birds to become disoriented and move around in a chaotic and stressed manner. They said this may be supported by the fact that when they went to the nets, there was a community level of response of birds because they found lots of mixed species assortments of birds captured during the height of totality. 7 different species in a single net. And you've bird banded before. That's weird to get that many species in a single net, on a single net run. So they said, regardless, the trend in movement suggests alterations in light and possibly temperature did trigger a change in movement. But it's tough to know exactly why and how that was happening. They did say the study is limited by a relatively small data set. You know, they did catch 39 birds that day, but in the grand scheme, that's not a huge number of birds.
Right. A lot of it's also, it seems like it's interpretation too, right? Like, it's kind of hard to
be able to pinpoint exactly.
Right.
This is what's happening. And they did say this is one specific location, one eclipse event. So their findings may not be broadly applicable to different locations, different bird species, or other eclipses.
Yeah.
All right. So at this point, you're probably thinking, boy, it just seems like a gigantic mess. Like animals are just doing all sorts of different things.
Right. So far, I mean, I sort of joked in the beginning, but like, it is still hard to say, even after hearing a lot of these, like, what happened. I mean, clearly,
Stuff happens. But...
Right. So the one thing that does seem, in a lot of cases, behavior changes, right?
Yes.
So
You can definitely say behavior often changes.
yeah.
So the last study that I'm going to kind of focus on is one from 2019. And this was a study that tried to compare social media observations of animals during an eclipse to published research.
Okay.
And again, they're taking this approach of, look, we have all this anecdotal data.
Mm-hmm.
How does it compare to actual research? The animals most frequently reported on social media reacting to the eclipse were invertebrates. So insects, and that's typically talking about insects calling, making noise. And birds. Birds were 35% of social media observations. Insects were 40%. A total of 26 published studies recorded 169 behavior observations with 131 different animal species. The group with the highest number of observations of animals was, what do you think?
Wait,
Birds.
Yeah.
You're right, birds. Most observations showed decreases in activity, followed by increases in vocalization. So,
But when you say decreases in activity, and this is from social media as well,
this is looking at both, I should have said.
right?
Yeah.
But I could imagine, like, if we go back to the mist netting one, and let's say even if we don't necessarily think that happens everywhere, the birds seem like they're still active, right? But like they're hunkering down potentially.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So they could be active, just sort of out of sight of potential predators or something, maybe.
Sure.
So it's like, sure, I'm not seeing them out my window, but like they could be
moving in concealed areas.
Right.
That's possible.
Yeah.
But
So I'm just saying, like, I'm just putting a caveat on inactivity.
And that's, I feel, what that banding study was talking about. They're saying, look, we caught all these birds. Were they moving about because they were disoriented and things were chaotic, or were they trying to get to a roosting spot?
Yeah.
We don't know. We're going to need more research. But overall, kind of the message that I got was, when you look at these compilation studies that kind of look at all these observations, I feel like those studies can show you what's probable is that you're going to see. But then when you look at more specific studies, it shows you what's possible that you might see, if that distinction makes sense. Now, I want to circle back to that paper from Wheeler that I talked about, the one from the early 20th century, where they gathered all of those observations, because I liked what he said at one point, where he said, no distinctions in behavior can be made between wild native species, domestic poultry, or caged birds. The reactions of birds to the eclipse were on the whole individual rather than specific. Some gulls and chickens thought night was coming, others did not. Some showed alarm, others did not. Some gulls and chickens paid no attention to the eclipse whatsoever. So, like with so many things we talk about, I just feel like so much more research is needed so we can get a much broader picture and a much broader data set of what animals do during an eclipse. Eclipses do happen on the Earth every 18 months, total solar eclipses, but obviously in very widespread areas.
Honestly, I was a little curious about that. I had no idea how often they happen, because clearly in a certain spot, it's going to be pretty rare, I imagine, but on the Earth, it's probably relatively common.
Yeah, in the same spot, it's like usually hundreds of years apart.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you say the early 19th century?
The early 20th century.
Okay, I thought you said 19th, but maybe I'm wrong.
I meant the 20th century. If I did. All right, so remember that pin I told you to put in about how animals started to react with a minor change?
Yeah. I do remember, but I don't remember being
I thought you were
that
talking to
point.
the audience. I do remember.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
I do.
Yeah, I remember you saying it, but
Yeah.
I can't remember the point.
So the study mentioned that the shift in behavior, the animals kind of settling in, kind of their nighttime mode, that started to happen when there was even just a slight change in light levels. A level at which maybe a person couldn't know that light was changing.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Now I remember this point.
Why are they reacting this way?
Are we allowed to make guesses at all?
Of course.
Okay, so the first thing that came to mind, because as Bill and Daniel know, I've been thinking about light that humans don't see recently. And I was wondering if maybe there's some bigger change that we don't see that's like outside of the visible spectrum.
Well, that's entirely possible, right?
Well, that was just the one thing I was thinking of. It's like maybe some other animals, maybe some birds or insects or something, they're noticing bigger changes in like UV or ultraviolet or something or UV or ultraviolet, no, infrared or ultraviolet that we don't see in the visible spectrum, but like they can already tell something's changing about the light, you know?
Well, driving to the point that I wanted to get to, just think about it. When in nature do we have a sudden drop in sunlight?
Cloud cover.
Cloud cover.
Yeah.
Rapidly approaching what?
Maybe a storm or something?
Right, a
Yeah.
rapidly approaching
okay.
storm.
I came across this.
Right?
Yeah, thinking maybe indicative of a storm coming.
Right. So the closest analogy to the sudden decrease,
And a sudden storm
Yeah.
out of nowhere.
sudden decrease in light and temperature for animals might be rapidly increasing cloud cover, which could mimic a storm. So it wouldn't be surprising that animals would be keyed into something like that. That was just something that never even occurred to me until I came across that in the literature.
I was thinking it, but I'm like, do animals not like look up at cloud cover at all? or they're only paying attention to light levels, you know what I mean? Like, because I did think about it. I think maybe certain insects, they maybe have never looked at a cloud in their life, right? But like, and I imagine, I don't know, maybe humans are the biggest sky gazers, but you have to imagine other things notice weather. I don't know.
There's your PhD study, Steve.
I mean, I'm going to start over at this point.
Yeah.
How bees identify clouds.
Are bees looking at shapes in the clouds?
For fun.
A Reflection by Dr.
Dr. Fleck.
Yeah.
Soon to be not Dr. Fleck. He's been stripped of his title. All right, so for future research, obviously we want to test these behaviors, examine the causes, and just research on all of these questions. It needs to become more rigorous. And that's going to require a big shift from observational accounts because those really dominate the literature, to experimental quantitative investigations of why, how, and when animals respond to solar eclipses. And I should say that looking at the atmospheric research on what happens during an eclipse, a lot of that was just a huge can of worms that I would not been able to have done justice to in this episode, or perhaps any episode, because they're talking about things way above my level of understanding.
Like astrology and...
Exactly.
It's not that hard to get there, though.
I don't know. I'm a Sagittarius. I'm pretty skeptical. So.
Typical Taurus.
So I wanted to wrap up by telling people how they could get involved. Now, unfortunately, we're going to try to get this out at the end of March, which doesn't give people a lot of time to get involved, but I am going to post this
A full week.
onto our social media as well. But
Translation, Daniel, edit this quickly.
this better be out tomorrow.
We need all that wind edited out.
Yeah.
But even if you're listening to this after the eclipse on April 8th, 2024, you
At
can
3:30. Yeah.
you can look up the results.
Uh-huh.
So Eclipse Soundscapes is an effort by NASA to encourage the general public to get more of those anecdotal observations that we don't want to have more of, but it would still be fun to get involved that way. And they're looking not just for animal observations, but also for weather observations, light, temperature, all those things. And then there's another one called Solar Eclipse Safari, which is operated by a group called SciStarter, which has tons of citizen science projects. So again, that's Eclipse Soundscapes and Solar Eclipse Safari. And then, listener, if you are not going to be within the path of totality, that does not mean you might not see animal activity influenced by the eclipse. There were a lot of sources I came across that stated observers were less likely to report unusual behavior when solar obscuration was less than 95%. Wheeler even stated in his study, the evidence is absolutely conclusive that birds of all kinds showed no unusual or abnormal behavior in regions where totality was 98% or less. But other papers mentioned, well, when obscuration is less than that, we don't notice the difference as much, so people probably aren't looking as much,
Right.
Yeah.
right?
That's true.
But as we've already said, animals pick up on those minute changes that we miss. There was one study from the 2017 eclipse, and it was from here in New York State. This was in the Kingbird, which is our New York State Ornithological Association. Why can't I say that? Ornithological Association.
And also our Birdathon team name.
That's right,
from
the
last year.
Kingbirds. That's their journal. They reported that turkey vultures and black vultures in Dutchess County, which is over on the east end of the state, they recorded vultures entering their roost shortly after partial eclipse commenced and emerging again after the eclipse had passed. And this occurred when there was very little perceptible difference in light levels.
Interesting.
But the turkey vultures could tell. But again, I did like that the authors went on to say that the vultures could have been responding to unrecognized stimuli. Something might have been going on that the authors didn't even notice.
Yeah.
Now,
I feel like that's the case for a lot of these observations.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
who knows what's
going on? But, if enough of them are similar and happening at the same time during the eclipse, chances are pretty good it's the eclipse. Now, the one thing that I was kind of too stupid to realize until I went to that program is this eclipse that's coming up on the 8th with millions of people coming into the path of totality to try to see it. What if it's
Cloudy.
What if it's cloudy,
Then
right?
we're all just
There's
gonna
a
get
good
wasted.
chance April in Buffalo.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So if it's cloudy, we're going to have a lot of disappointed people.
But it's still going to get extra dark.
It will get dark, and that's what I've heard, is that if it's cloudy, it will still get dark. And if there's a thin layer of clouds, you'll still be able to see it pretty well.
Oh, nice.
But if it is totally cloudy and you can't see it and you're disappointed, the next total eclipse will be in 2026, but you're going to have to go to Greenland, Iceland, or Spain to see it. So I think
An excuse to travel.
we should do that.
Yeah.
There you go.
But here in the States, in the lower 48, the next one won't be until 2044.
Wow.
Whoosh.
That's going to be in Canada and the U.S., and it's only going to hit Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. All right, so that is everything I had. I'm just going to recommend everybody to get out there, if you can, on April 8th. Check out the eclipse and be observing those animals. Get more of those anecdotal records that we have too many of, apparently.
Oh, there was one thing I wanted to say, is when I did the eclipse in 2017, Well, I did it.
You did it.
Yeah, I did it. Sorry,
Steve made it
guys.
happen.
Yeah. Of course, my eyes were like glued to the skies, right? But one thing I didn't think about until after the eclipse was it's important to also look at shadows during the eclipse, because like, let's say even if little like pins of light are coming through like trees, well, it's going to be April. Well, either way, you'll get like these like crescent shaped light coming through the shadows.
You'll get the image of the moon going over the sun.
Yeah, I said it so poorly, but yeah, it's you
Thanks,
won't get
I know what he's talking about.
You won't get the typical like light coming through.
Yeah.
In fact, I think you can even poke some holes in a piece of paper, and you'll see like little crescent shapes and stuff with the light coming through.
The program I went to said just hold up a colander, and that'll project all those holes. Will project it onto the ground in front of you.
Because I'm pretty sure, what is it, like the camera obscura? Isn't that the pinhole camera or whatever it is?
That sounds right.
Really, what you're looking at is like a picture of the sun when you do that, in a sense, like sort of. So, but this time, because the sun's covered, you're not getting the full circle of the sun. You're just getting these like crescents of the sun. So.
And I do feel that we didn't stress it enough about looking at the eclipse.
Oh, right.
Outside of totality.
With your special glasses.
Don't do it, folks. Yeah, just use those special glasses.
Yeah.
But you also have to be careful, because some eclipse glasses, you have to look at what they say, and it has to say something on there that they can handle looking at directly at the eclipse.
Wow. Another thing is, and this is something I was warned about beforehand, I took pictures of the eclipse, but I put that lens over my camera as well, because I think you're really not supposed to zoom in onto the sun, because it could actually damage the inner parts of your camera.
I've heard that.
I'm so glad you said that before. I destroyed my nice wildlife camera.
Yeah.
All right, so Daniel's going to do the wrap up for us today.
Oh, maybe we should find better shelter though.
Oh.
Let's do it.
All right.
All right, so we found some shelter. Yeah. Now Daniel's going to wrap up for us.
All right, here we go. First and foremost, we'd like to thank our growing list of Patreon supporters. So thank you to our new patrons: Dylan B, Cecilia D, Gail and Mac, Michaelo, Amber, and Sean M. We also like to give a special shout out each month to our top patrons, so stick around for the end of the episode to hear Bill's daughter Violet share that list. And remember, if you'd like to be part of the Field Guides and read our Patreon list in a future episode, email us at thefieldguides@gmail.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast, consider becoming a patron of our show at patreon.com. As a patron, you'll get access to a special patrons-only version of our episodes that include Bill sharing the episode notes. Because of support from our listeners, we've been able to keep the show free and make cooler episodes, like last month's field trip to look for Florida Panthers, which was definitely the best one. Or you can make a one-time donation through PayPal on our website. And don't forget that we have Field Guides merch available through our website store at thefieldguidespodcast.com. And remember, if you can't financially support the podcast, you can certainly help out by sharing it with friends and family, and by subscribing and leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps spread the word and allows us to reach a wider audience. We'd like to thank our newest iTunes reviewers, Sloth Travel Club and Tigerhead Snake Tail. What? Come enjoy our sporadic posts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can always email us ideas for episode topics, criticisms, or your stories of encounters with eclipse-crazed wildlife to thefieldguides@gmail.com.
And parents, remember to get those kids outside. Let them get muddy, dirty, flip over rocks and logs. And if you don't have any kids, try to make time to get yourself outside. Folks, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye, everybody.
And here is Violet with this episode's top patrons.
Charcuterie, Eric, Alyssa, Adam, the Hebranks, Mary R., Sung, Dr. Judy, Kimberly, Peter R., Callie, Jessica, Orange Julianne, Daniel, Diane, we named the dog Indy, Hot Dog Cold Weather, JJ Cathay, Dwayne H., Jonathan A., Cecilia, Julie B., Dennis, Leslie H., Chris N., Jeff S., Colin G., M. Toulan, Brant S., Jonathan K., Matt E., Plants in My Pants, Sean M., Sophie, Connor H., Measure and Principle, Fragaria papillonoidea, Outside Chronicles, Andrew C., Quixote, Matt D., Jake M., Melissa Marie and Dusty AZ, Sarah S., Helen A., Judy F., Ben C., Jane H., Doodle Dude 82, Gail and Mac, Kazzies, Jeff S., Esther C., John W., Mark V., Bethany H., Rob M., Hannah.
Well done.
Thank you.
And patrons, thank you. Daniel, Steve, and I appreciate all of your support. Thank you for keeping the field guides free and for making these episodes possible.
Bye.